It was over. That is what they believed. 3 years, thousands of miles walked together, mountains crossed, deserts passed through, storms survived on open water in the middle of the night. Everything they had abandoned, their families, their fishing boats, their tax tables, their entire futures, all of it surrendered for one man. One man who had said things no one had ever said before, who had done things no one had ever done before, who had walked into synagogues full of scholars and made every argument collapse with a single sentence, who had looked at sick people and made them well, who had looked at dead people and made them breathe, who had looked at 11 ordinary men from the poorest region of Judea and told them they would change the world. And now that man was dead. The cross had done what crosses always do. It had taken everything and left nothing behind but a body, a borrowed tomb, and 11 men who had absolutely no idea what to do next. This is not the story of the resurrection. This is the story of the 40 hours before it, the hours that no sermon covers, the hours that no painting shows, the hours when the followers of Jesus Christ were the most terrified, most broken, most confused people in the entire city of Jerusalem. And this is the story of what those hours actually looked like. To understand what happened to the disciples after the cross, you have to understand what Jerusalem looked like in those days. This was not a quiet city. Jerusalem in 33 AD was a powder keg. The Roman Empire had been occupying Judea for nearly a century. Pontius Pilate had been prefect for 4 years, and his relationship with the Jewish leadership was already strained almost to breaking. There had been riots before. There had been uprisings before. Rome had crushed every single one of them with the same answer: the cross. The cross was not just an execution method. It was a political statement. Rome positioned crosses on the highest hills, on the most visible roads, at the most traveled gates. Because the message wasn't meant for the person dying on it. The message was meant for everyone watching. This is what we do to people who challenge us. This is what we do to kings who aren't Caesar. And on the 14th of Nisan, 33 AD, that message had just been delivered, publicly, visibly, at a place called Golgotha, just outside the city walls, to the man that 11 people had given their entire lives to follow. When the soldiers came to the Garden of Gethsemane the night before, the disciples had been asleep. 3 times Jesus had walked back from prayer and found them sleeping. 3 times. And then the torches appeared through the trees, and the soldiers. And Judas, walking at the front of the group, moving toward Jesus with a greeting that had been arranged in advance. "Greetings, Rabbi." A kiss, that was the signal. That was how the soldiers knew which man to arrest in the dark. And then something extraordinary happened. Peter, impulsive, volcanic Peter, drew a sword and swung it. He struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his right ear, a man named Malchus. And Jesus reached out, touched the man's ear, and healed him. Right there, in the middle of his own arrest, in the dark, surrounded by soldiers with the knowledge of what was coming, he healed the man whose ear Peter had just cut off. And then he turned to Peter and said, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword." And the soldiers took him. And then the Gospel of Mark records something that has puzzled scholars for 2,000 years. A young man was following Jesus, dressed only in a linen cloth. When the soldiers seized him, he left the cloth in their hands and ran away naked. Who was he? No name, no explanation, just a detail so specific, so strange, that most scholars believe it could only have been included by someone who was there. Someone who was ashamed of running. Some believe it was Mark himself, the author of the Gospel, writing his own humiliation into the record without naming himself. We don't know for certain. What we know is that he ran, and he was not the only one. Then all the disciples forsook him and fled. Matthew 26:56, all of them. Peter followed at a distance. He kept Jesus in sight, far enough back to feel safe, close enough to see where they were taking him. Through the streets of Jerusalem in the middle of the night, toward the house of Caiaphas, the high priest. There was a courtyard and a fire, and a servant girl who looked at Peter across the flames and said, "You also were with Jesus of Galilee." Peter said, "I don't know what you're talking about." He moved to the gateway. Another servant girl recognized him. He denied it again. Then a group of bystanders said, "Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." And Peter began to curse and swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately, at that exact moment, a rooster crowed. And Peter remembered, and he went outside and wept bitterly. By morning, the trial was already over. It had not been a trial by Roman standards. It had been a verdict that needed a process attached to it. The chief priests and the Sanhedrin had already decided what the outcome would be. They needed the charges to justify it. They brought in witnesses. The witnesses contradicted each other. Finally, Caiaphas stood up and asked the question directly, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." That was enough. They handed him to Pilate before dawn. Pilate didn't want this. The Gospels are unanimous about this detail. Pilate examined Jesus and found no fault in him. He sent him to Herod Antipas, who happened to be in Jerusalem for the Passover, hoping to pass the problem. Herod sent him back. Pilate tried to release him under the Passover custom of freeing one prisoner. The crowd chose Barabbas. Pilate's wife sent him a message. "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered much today in a dream because of him." Pilate asked the crowd, "What evil has he done?" They shouted louder, "Crucify him." And Pilate, the most powerful Roman official in the region, called for a bowl of water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." And they did. The crucifixion took 6 hours, from approximately 9 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. Most of the disciples were not there. We know from the Gospels that John was present, the only one of the 12 specifically recorded as standing at the foot of the cross. Jesus looked down at him and at Mary, his mother, standing beside him, and said, "Woman, behold your son. Behold your mother." And from that hour, John took her into his own home. The others, they were somewhere in Jerusalem, hiding, waiting, trying to be invisible in a city that was buzzing with what was happening at Golgotha, because Jerusalem during Passover was not a small crowd. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, estimated that over 2 million people were in Jerusalem during Passover. Other historians put the number lower, but even the conservative estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of pilgrims, all of them in the city at the same time, all of them aware of the execution taking place outside the walls. 11 men trying to disappear in that crowd. At noon, something happened. Darkness. Luke 23:44. It was now about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. 3 hours of darkness, in the middle of the day. This was not a solar eclipse. The Passover always occurs at a full moon, and a solar eclipse is impossible during a full moon. Whatever it was, multiple ancient historians outside the Gospels recorded it. Thallus, writing in approximately 52 AD, referred to an unusual darkness that occurred during the reign of Tiberius. Julius Africanus, commenting on Thallus's account, connected it to the crucifixion. 3 hours of darkness over Jerusalem. And then, at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out with a loud voice and died. And at that moment, in the temple, 600 meters from the hill where Jesus had just died, the veil tore. A curtain 60 feet tall, woven fabric 4 inches thick, the barrier that had stood between the Holy of Holies and the rest of the temple since the days of Solomon. It tore in two, from top to bottom, not from bottom to top, the way a human hand would tear fabric, from the top down. And then the ground shook. Rocks split. Matthew records something even stranger. Tombs opened, and after the resurrection, many bodies of saints who had died were raised and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. Matthew 27:52-53. This detail is so extraordinary that many scholars have debated it for centuries, but Matthew recorded it, and Matthew was there. The centurion standing at the foot of the cross watched all of this happen. A Roman soldier, a professional, a man who had stood at executions before. Who knew what dying looked like? Who knew what a criminal looked like? He looked at what had just happened, the darkness, the earthquake, the way Jesus had died, and said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." A Roman centurion. At the cross, Joseph of Arimathea went to Pilate before sundown. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, the same body that had condemned Jesus. But the Gospels tell us he had not consented to the decision. He was a secret disciple, waiting for the kingdom of God, afraid to be publicly identified with Jesus while he was alive. He went to Pilate and asked for the body. Pilate was surprised that Jesus was already dead. Crucifixion could take days, and it had only been 6 hours. He summoned the centurion to confirm it. The centurion confirmed it, and Pilate released the body to Joseph. Joseph bought fine linen. He and Nicodemus, another secret disciple, another member of the Sanhedrin, brought about 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. They wrapped the body. They placed it in a new tomb cut from rock in a garden near the place of crucifixion. They rolled a large stone against the door, and they left. It was the evening of the 14th of Nisan, and somewhere in Jerusalem, in an upper room with a locked door, the disciples were beginning to understand that it was over. Not all 11 of them were there at first. Some had scattered farther. Some were in the homes of people who had sheltered them. Some may have fled the city entirely in the first hours of panic. But as Friday night moved into Saturday, as the Sabbath settled over Jerusalem and locked the city down, they found each other, and they locked the door. John 20:19 is precise. The doors were shut where the disciples were assembled for fear of the Jews. Fear. That word carries everything. These men understood with absolute clarity what Rome did to the associates of a condemned revolutionary. Jesus had been executed as a king, a title that was, under Roman law, a direct challenge to the authority of Caesar. Every man connected to him was a potential target, and they were not strangers in Jerusalem. They had been there for days. They had been seen with him in the temple courts. They had been seen at the triumphal entry. Some of them had been present at the trial in the high priest's courtyard. People knew their faces. Think about who was in that room. Peter, who had just denied knowing Jesus 3 times, who had heard the rooster crow, who was carrying something that no amount of silence could quiet. John, who had stood at the foot of the cross and watched every moment, who had seen what crucifixion actually looked like up close, who was now responsible for the mother of the man they had just buried. James, John's brother, one of the 3 who had been in the garden the night of the arrest, who had watched Jesus pray in such agony that his sweat fell like drops of blood and had fallen asleep through it. Thomas, methodical, analytical Thomas, who had said earlier in their journey, "Let us also go that we may die with him." He had meant it, he had been willing, and when the moment came, he had done exactly what the others had done. He had run. Matthew, a former tax collector who had once sat at a customs booth collecting money for Rome, who had left everything to follow a man who was now dead, executed by the empire Matthew had once served. Simon the Zealot, a man whose political identity before Jesus had been built on violent resistance to Rome, who had joined a movement of peace, who was now watching peace be crushed by exactly the forces he had once wanted to fight. These were not abstractions. These were specific men with specific histories, with specific reasons why this failure cut them in specific places. And they were all in the same locked room. And Judas was not there. Because by that morning, Judas Iscariot had already made his way back to the temple. He had seen the condemnation. Matthew 27:3 says he repented himself, a word that means he was seized with remorse. He took the 30 pieces of silver back to the chief priests and elders. "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." And the chief priests said, "What is that to us? See to it yourself." They didn't want the money back. It was blood money, ritually unclean, forbidden from the temple treasury. Judas threw the coins into the temple and left, and went out, and hanged himself. The chief priests picked up the silver and discussed what to do with it. They couldn't put it into the treasury. The law forbade it, so they used it to buy a field from a potter, a place to bury strangers. That field, Matthew records, was still called the field of blood when he was writing his gospel. 30 pieces of silver, enough to buy a cemetery. Saturday, the Sabbath. No movement, no work, No travel beyond a short walking distance. Under Jewish law, the Sabbath was absolute, more so during Passover. The city was quiet in a way that felt wrong. There were still hundreds of thousands of pilgrims in Jerusalem. The Passover feast had happened just 2 nights ago, but the energy of the city had shifted. Word had traveled. People were talking about what had happened at Golgotha, about the darkness, about the earthquake, about the veil of the temple. There were questions that no one had answers to. And in the upper room, the disciples sat with the worst version of those questions. Here is what none of them could reach yet. Jesus had told them. He had told them clearly, directly, multiple times after the transfiguration on the mountain. The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the 3rd day. On the road to Jerusalem, with the city already visible in the distance, see, we are going up to Jerusalem. And the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified, and he will be raised on the 3rd day. In the temple courts, in front of crowds, in private conversations, in parables, and in plain speech, he had told them. And Mark 9:32 records the disciples' response. But they did not understand this saying and were afraid to ask him. Afraid to ask, so they had stored the word somewhere they couldn't access. The mind does that when a truth is too large to hold. It hears the words and files them somewhere deep and quiet and unreachable. And in that locked room on the Sabbath, with the stone sealed and the soldiers stationed and everything finished, the words stayed in that deep, quiet place, and the silence was absolute. At some point during those hours, the chief priests and Pharisees went to Pilate. Matthew 27:62-64 records the conversation. "Sir, we remember how that impostor said, while he was still alive, 'After 3 days I will rise.' Therefore order the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people he has risen from the dead, and the last fraud will be worse than the first." Pilate said, "You have a guard of soldiers. Go, make it as secure as you can." So they went and made the tomb secure, sealing the stone and setting a guard. Think about the layers of that decision. The disciples were in a locked room, terrified, not even discussing what to do next. They had no plan, no capacity for action. They were barely surviving the present hour, and their enemies were posting armed soldiers at the tomb to prevent a resurrection plot that existed only in their own imagination. Saturday night, the Sabbath ended. And while the disciples were still in the upper room, the women were already moving. Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, Salome. These women had not run at the garden. They had watched the crucifixion from a distance. Luke records that they stood far off, watching. They had followed Joseph of Arimathea to the tomb. They had seen where the body was laid. They had noted how it was positioned. And as soon as the Sabbath was over, they went to buy spices and ointments. Not because they expected anything, because they wanted to finish anointing the body properly. Because the burial had been rushed, it was already close to Sabbath when Joseph and Nicodemus had finished. Because this was the last act of service they could perform for someone they had loved. They left before dawn. And as they walked in the dark, they said to each other, "Who will roll away the stone from the door of the tomb for us?" It was a practical question, an honest question. The stone was massive, beyond what they could move. They had no answer. They just kept walking. Because sometimes the only thing you can do is walk toward the problem. Mary Magdalene arrived at the garden first. The stone was already moved. She didn't go inside. She didn't wait to investigate. Her first thought, her immediate human grief-shaped thought, was, "Someone has taken the body." She turned and ran. Back through the streets of Jerusalem, still mostly empty in the early morning, back to where Peter and John were. They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Peter and John ran. John was younger. He outran Peter and arrived first. He bent down, looked into the tomb from the entrance, saw the linen cloths lying there, and stopped. Peter arrived and went straight in. The cloths were there, the linen that had wrapped the body, and the face cloth, the piece of linen that had been around Jesus' head, was not thrown aside with the rest. It was folded up and set in a place by itself. That detail, that folded cloth. If someone had stolen the body, they would not have taken time to unwrap it and fold the face cloth. You don't fold linen in the middle of a theft. You take what you came for and you run. The cloth was folded, set apart. John went in. He saw and believed. John 28. But then, immediately, verse 9, for as yet they did not know the scripture that he must rise again from the dead, even standing inside the empty tomb, even with the evidence directly in front of him, even after seeing and believing, they still did not fully understand what they were looking at. They went back to the others, and they left Mary Magdalene alone in the garden, weeping. She stood outside the tomb and wept, and then she bent down and looked inside. 2 angels, sitting where the body had been, one at the head, one at the feet, in white. They asked her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." And she turned around, and there was a man standing there. She did not recognize him. Through her tears in the early morning light, in the last place she expected to see anyone, she looked at this man and assumed he was the gardener. "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." She would carry the body herself. Wherever it was, however far, she would carry it back. And then the man said one word, "Mary," her name, in a voice she had heard 1,000 times, in markets and on hillsides and on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, in a voice that had said her name the way no voice had ever said it before, like it meant something, like she meant something. And she knew. She turned toward him. Rabboni, teacher. She ran back to the disciples with 11 words that should have been impossible. "I have seen the Lord," and they did not believe her. Mark 16:11. And when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they did not believe it. Luke is even more specific. When the women reported everything to the 11 and to all the rest, these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. An idle tale. That is what resurrection looked like to men who were still locked in grief. Later that same day, still the first day of the week, 2 of the disciples were walking to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. Just walking, getting out of the city, talking about everything that had happened. A stranger joined them on the road. He asked what they were discussing. They stopped. Cleopas, one of them, looked at this stranger as if he were the only person in the world who hadn't heard the news. "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" The stranger said, "What things?" And they told him. About Jesus of Nazareth, about his words and his miracles, about the crucifixion, about the women who had gone to the tomb that morning and found it empty and reported seeing angels. But him they did not see. That line, the disappointment in it, the careful, precise way they distinguished between the empty tomb, which they could accept, and the living Jesus, which they could not let themselves believe. And the stranger began to speak, starting from Moses, through all the prophets, explaining, step by step, everything that the scriptures had said about the one who was to come, about the suffering that had to happen, about the glory that would follow. They walked 7 miles and didn't know who was walking with them. They arrived at Emmaus as evening approached. The stranger made as if he would go further. They urged him to stay. He sat at the table with them. He took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and he vanished. And they looked at each other across the table with broken bread in their hands. Did not our hearts burn within us while he talked to us on the road, while he opened to us the scriptures? They got up immediately, that same hour at night, and walked the 7 miles back to Jerusalem. That evening, doors still locked, still 11 men inside, still afraid. Jesus came and stood among them, not through the door, not at the window, not announced, among them. "Peace be with you." And he showed them his hands and his side. And John 20:20. Then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. Glad. After 40 hours of the heaviest fear any of them had ever carried. Glad. Thomas wasn't there that evening. He was the one who had been absent. And when the others found him and told him what had happened, He said the words that became the most famous expression of doubt in human history. "Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Not a lack of faith, something more honest than that. Thomas had been willing to die with Jesus. He had said so, out loud in front of the others. He had meant it. And then the arrest had come and he had run like everyone else. And then the crucifixion had come and it had been real, unmistakably, horribly real. And the grief of that reality had built a wall that rumors could not reach, a wall that second-hand reports could not move. 8 days passed. The disciples were together again. Thomas with them this time, doors locked again. Jesus appeared again and looked directly at Thomas. "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." No judgment, no lecture, no disappointment performed for the room. Just, "Here, look, see." And Thomas looked and said the words that none of them had yet said out loud, the words that were the destination the whole story had been moving toward. "My Lord and my God." 40 hours. That is how long the darkness lasted, from the sealing of the stone to the finding of the empty tomb. 40 hours in which 11 men believed that history had ended, that everything they had hoped for had been crushed, that the most extraordinary person any of them had ever known was simply gone, buried in a borrowed tomb, mourned by women while his closest friends hid behind a locked door. 40 hours in which the women were the ones who kept moving, who bought the spices, who walked to the tomb before dawn, who stayed when the men went back, who became the first witnesses. 40 hours in which the enemies of Jesus were paying soldiers to guard a tomb that was already empty. 40 hours that changed the trajectory of every civilization that would ever be built on this planet. Because here's the historical question that has never been answered. If the resurrection did not happen, if the body was still in the tomb, or had been stolen, or had been moved to another location, the enemies of Jesus had every reason in the world to produce it. The movement that became Christianity spread through Jerusalem first, the same Jerusalem where Jesus had been crucified, the same city where the tomb was, the same city where the chief priests lived, the same city where the Roman soldiers who had been stationed at the tomb were still stationed. All anyone had to do was walk to the tomb and show the body. They never did. Not because they couldn't find the tomb. They knew exactly where it was. They had put soldiers there. They never produced the body because there was no body to produce. The disciples who hid behind locked doors went on to do things that people who are protecting a lie do not do. Peter, who had denied Jesus 3 times by a fire, stood up in Jerusalem 7 weeks later and preached to thousands of people in the streets of the same city where the crucifixion had happened. James, the brother of Jesus, who had not believed in Jesus during his ministry, became the leader of the church in Jerusalem and was eventually executed for his testimony. Thomas, whose doubt had been so total that he required physical evidence, tradition records him taking the message to India, where he died for it. Stephen was stoned. James, the son of Zebedee, was beheaded. Peter was crucified, upside down, at his own request, because he said he was not worthy to die in the same position as Jesus. People die for things they believe to be true, but people do not die for things they know to be a lie. 11 men who ran from a garden in the middle of the night spent the rest of their lives, and most of them their deaths, testifying to one thing: the tomb was empty. They had seen him. He was alive. Jerusalem, 33 AD. The third morning. A stone moved from a door, linen folded and set aside. A woman standing in a garden, hearing her name spoken in a voice she recognized before she understood what she was hearing, and 11 men who had locked a door against the world, walking out into the rest of history.